You are listening to Business Talk, a podcast where global voices in business, academia, public policy, and leadership come together to spark meaningful conversations. I'm Deepak, joining you from India. It's a true privilege to welcome Dr. Margaret Brindle with us today, as she shares valuable insights from her book, Social Entrepreneurship for Development, a Business Model. Before we begin, let me briefly introduce today's guest. Professor Margaret Brindle brings more than 25 years of experience in higher education, specializing in public administration, leadership, and social entrepreneurship. She earned her PhD, postdoctoral research in organizational behavior, Master of Public Management from Carnegie Mellon University, along with a Bachelor of Science in Management from Point Park University. An associate professor of public policy at University of Maryland, Dr. Brindle has taught over 140 semester-long courses across diverse academic and professional audiences, including leadership programs at the US Naval Academy. Her teaching portfolio spans executive education, international development, entrepreneurship, and organizational behavior, reaching learners from Washington, D.C. to China. An accomplished author, Professor Brindle has written 5 books, including Social Entrepreneurship for Development in second edition and developed 10 workbooks on applying intellectual property strategies for sustainable trade focus on e-Africa. Beyond academia, she actively collaborates with the Maasai community of Kenya and Tanzania and with women entrepreneurs in Uganda, helping to build inclusive ecosystems through enterprise and education. She co-founded the African IP Trust, an organization supporting women-led social ventures across Africa, funded through multi-million dollar grants from partners such as the US Patent and Trademark Office, the US Trade Representative, Comic Relief, and the Kellogg Foundation. As a former director of education for the Ashoka supported Light Years IP, she has led training and development initiatives for trade ministers, professors, farmers, public officials, and community leaders across East Africa. The goal is to enable low-income producers to earn higher incomes via community ownership and IP trade strategies. Dr. Brindle has contributed to the academic community through roles on the boards of the Journal of Fair Trade editorial roles, on the Journal of Management Education, and issues in qualitative organizational research. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Margaret Brindle to the conversation. Professor Margaret, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
Thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to
Professor,
be here.
thank you, Professor. Professor, the book promises a fresh approach to poverty alleviation by bridging international development and social entrepreneurship. What gap between these two fields were you most intent on closing when you designed this business model?
Thank you. Well, it begins with history, as so many things do, right? When international development became formalized, it was after World War II. The British began DFID, the Department for International Development, and the US began a Marshall Plan. We pumped billions, literally, into Western Europe to try to shore up those countries against communism, against further aggression. Remember, we had just been through both World War I and World War II. And so most of the focus, Deepak, was economic, trying to foster stability. And then, it morphed a bit into further efforts to provide food, education. But if you look at the USAID budget, even in 2024, the last budget we have public, before it got a bit challenged in our country, the largest aid recipients were in Ukraine, Israel, Afghanistan, and a fairly good portion of the budget was toward shoring up their infrastructure as well as military. USAID has accomplished great things. International development has, as it's grown into most Western European countries, Japan, Korea, even China has international development at this point. And most of the effort is toward large projects with large agendas. Some of them have accomplished things, I guess we see overall in the 60 years roughly since international development is formalized, we see a lot of impact and improvement in health, epidemics, communicable disease, reduction in infant and child mortality, education. And so it's not been without its real achievements. The difference with social entrepreneurship, though, is social entrepreneurs tend to be individuals. We call it the citizen sector. Begin with an idea to change and produce some transformational change. Social entrepreneurship has really grown, though. It goes back, it's not a brand new effort. We can go back to Florence Nightingale, could be considered a social entrepreneur. Francis of Assisi, trying to create new systems for health. I just came from visiting Ireland, which is full of entrepreneurs. Social entrepreneurship has developed. My favorite organization of social entrepreneurs is Ashoka. It's ASHOKA.com. You may, .org. They're in about 103 countries, but we tend to call it the citizen sector. So the gap that we're trying to show here, and the reason the book is called Social Entrepreneurship, is that it relies heavily on country efforts, on building those ecosystems. My litmus test is, will this sustain when I'm gone? By drawing on the resources that are there, not financial resources, oftentimes as much as the human resources.
Professor, you outlined a six-step method for intellectual property business positioning. Could you walk us through these six steps in practice using one African producer or cooperative as an example of how the method actually unfolds on the ground?
Okay. Well, Deepak, the reason we call it a six-step method is not to be pedantic or to say, you've just got to have all of these steps in this order. But it came about because we saw a lot of efforts going into low-income countries saying, if you just do this, that will be the panacea. Just do this. And that this was, let's just create brands, just brand everything, or just get the trademark, or just begin a business. And those things in isolation tend to lead to some failures. I wrote a book once on management faddism and leadership faddism, and we don't want to present something that is a panacea that leaves people not any better off. Unfortunately, I'm afraid we have done some of that over the decades into low-income countries. So this six-step method is really a business model. It says, if you don't mind, I'll unpack the six steps since you asked me. The first step is really looking for distinctive products. That is there a product that's really capable of earning more, of having an intellectual property trade strategy? I have one here. This is an example of Ugandan vanilla. Ugandan vanilla is the highest concentration of vanillin of any vanilla in the world. 2 pods, I see one is gone. I must have had a cook in the kitchen help themselves, but 2 pods of this in Whole Foods will sell for $12. The Ugandan vanilla farmer gets about 3 cents, but it's truly distinctive. So the first step is to find distinctive products. When my colleague, Ron Layton, who really got this model into its first big success with Ethiopian coffee, found Ethiopian coffee as a really distinctive product. And then DFID funded him 7 times to go looking for further distinctive products. Distinctive products. Mozambique, cashews are distinctive. In northern Uganda, the shea butter grows in a special climate that is distinctive. So distinctiveness is the first. The second is the product capable of positioning, of being repositioned a bit on the markets? Oftentimes, what I found in analysis of, oh gosh, we looked at 15 distinctive products, ranging from Zanzibar spices to Tanzanian blackwood to coffee. We find the farmers and producers getting about 3% of the retail when it's sold on the commodity markets inside the country. So we next look at, is it capable of being positioned differently? Third, we look at price gaps. Is this capable, for example, this Ugandan vanilla? If this were not selling for $20 in Whole Foods, if the market of specialty cooks were not growing, if there wasn't a demand for this, we would stop right then. So we look at that. Is there really a capacity to earn more? In my Ugandan shea butter, for example, women will spend, are you ready for this? On Amazon, there are skin products selling for $595 a jar, with the essential ingredient being shea butter. That market is growing. So we look at that. Is it really possible to earn more? Because it costs a little bit to get a business going and some effort. And then we look, is there clear social impact? Are there stakeholders that are clearly able to benefit? Usually that's the easier one because almost always yes. But we want to be sure that the product is such that we can form a stakeholder group. Using shea butter again, we're working up in northern Uganda. We have a women's group up there. I call it WANS, Women's Owned Nilotica Shea, with a constitution, with training, but it's very hard right now to work in South Sudan, where the shea is also growing. Um, and then, is it possible to uh, have a viable stakeholder group that links to the fourth? And is it possible to have social impact investment? Because it takes some investment to really get a business going. So we like to be sure that we're not creating pie in the sky by just telling people just get a trademark, just get a brand, because that is not where the income comes. The income comes from the licensing that you can do with that brand, and etc.
Professor, a core theme of the book is shifting producers from being raw material suppliers to being owners of brands in foreign markets. What are the biggest mindset and power shifts required for farmers, artisans, or women entrepreneurs to actually see themselves as a brand owners rather than just producers?
That's another excellent question. I think, Deepak, it starts with education and the vision. The women in northern Uganda, when I'm out training, when I tell them what their shea butter can be worth in Western markets, first they fall off their chairs laughing. Who would believe that women would spend $500 a jar? Their annual income is $800 a year, you know. And so I think first it's creating the vision that there is a better way. It doesn't need to be work harder, work harder, work harder. Because the problem with working harder is oftentimes as supply grows, as you know, in basic economics, prices are not, go down, and then a lot of volatility. I have a slide that shows that. I call it my psychedelic slide. The more we grow, price volatility. So showing them how to get out ahead of that. So I think the first thing is really showing the vision. When I do training, I did some training recently into 8 universities in Uganda of change makers, farmers, professors. I'll start with the pie chart. People don't sometimes realize what a small part of that pie they're receiving. And I'll ask the question, where do you want to be? Where do you want to be? And it is possible to create an import company rather than, sorry, I'm talking about this pie chart sort of without showing an example. I wish I could show an example by sharing my screen, but you get this kind of a chart where you have this tiny, tiny amount to the producer, tiny amount to the exporter, and the importer and the retailer taking the lion's share. So that's the beginning. We can teach them how to own that import company. With the Maasai tribe, there are 2 million Maasai. Hundreds of companies use their name and image. And when they look at what their product name is being sold for, they too are aghast. So, to your question, I think it's first creating the vision and then the education piece, how to get there. I will never forget the day that I took one of our Maasai leaders came to Maryland, where I'm sitting today, and we went to a jewelry store and we looked at the products named Maasai. There's a jewelry store called Marco Bisigo. It's out of Italy, but they sell all over Europe and the US. They have a line of Masai name jewelry, and it sells for between about 2,000 to 40,000 US dollars a pop, each piece. And they have 70 of those, and they have a catalog that says this is inspired by the Maasai. So here's my Maasai friend with his Maasai garb on, just aghast. Look at what our name and image are adding to this company, and we get zero. So that's the answer, I think, is being able to share the vision and the knowledge. It's a little tricky. Sometimes my students, I teach international development, sometimes they'll say, Professor, is that fair to do? Are you going in there imposing Western ideas on these people? And I have to scratch my head sometimes and think a little bit, but we're exploiting them and they need to know about it. The third thing, my colleague who runs a very interesting social entrepreneurial organization in Uganda, it's called Roots Africa. You can look it up, rootsafrica.com. He creates farmer-owned ecosystems. Cedric is really big on teaching AI. He said AI is the great leveler. You don't have to be in the dark anymore about what your products are selling. So I think those two things, the vision, the education, and then creating the power piece. And the power piece is sometimes their own organization. It took years to reach, there are 2 million Maasai in Kenya and Tanzania. The on-the-ground training was really important, the train-the-trainer model, meeting at the border of Kenya and Tanzania to establish the Maasai Intellectual Property Initiative is their ownership of this. So it's not just pie in the sky, it's we can own it. And then, as you can probably tell, I'm a pretty big believer in history. I love to show the historical record. People have done this. I have in my hand an orange. It's a sun-kissed orange. These orange farmers were quite poor. And well before we had orange juice every day as something we just enjoy as a habit, they created a brand, Sunkissed. They positioned it. They created their cooperative. It is possible. Deepak, IP goes way back. We think of it as something that lawyers learn, but I did a study for the US Trade Reps Office once of 10 successes and 10 failures in intellectual property business strategies. And it was eye-opening to me to see that 47 AD was the first record I could find of farmers wanting to own their own intellectual property. 47 AD. Roquefort cheese. They knew that they were creating something of value, something special. And they asked their leader at the time, I can't quite remember the type of government they had, but to issue a certificate that said, only we know how to make Roquefort cheese. We own it. It's ours. It's our creation. I think it's fundamental to the human nature when we know we own something, something really valuable and special. And so Roquefort cheese is the oldest that I could find. It's called a geographical indicator, similar to French champagne. The French champagne farmers, growers learned the same thing. Scotch whiskey. I think it's the artist knows when they have something that really should belong to them. I find that particularly true with indigenous people, such as the Maasai. They know they have a brand. They travel. They are on, everybody has a phone. Everybody has a mobile phone. You may not have a great deal else, but everybody has a mobile phone and they can see, increasingly how their culture is being misappropriated. So sorry, that's a long answer. I'll kick it back to you.
Thank you. Professor, you emphasize producer control of the entire supply chain, including distribution to retail stores. In your experience, with groups like Masai and women's enterprises in Uganda, what practical strategies have helped local producers gain leverage over those downstream distribution decisions?
Yep. Well, The Maasai is a little different than a physical product. For example, most of the products we work with are physical products. The Maasai is frankly a brand with the product not owned by the Maasai, but out there in the market. So let me take each of those individually. Um, your question is what explicit strategies they need. Well, for the Maasai, the first really was the research. Which companies are uh, have the higher brand values so that we can calculate what a normal licensing strategy would be. So for the Maasai, being used by Louis Vuitton, for example, by a high-end jewelry company, by Jaguar Land Rover, by some celebrities, those are the companies we want to approach first because that's going to be the higher ROI, the return for the Maasai. Um, Legal strategies are important. Um, Being able to have a legal entity to own a brand is important. When we first began with the Maasai, we hadn't taken the as much time to form their legal entity, and we got into a little bit of diciness where it was who owns it, right? Is it this Maasai? Is it that Maasai? And so we had to step back and spend a good year in training and making sure we were meeting at the border of Kenya and Tanzania, register that name and that legal entity. So establishing the legal entity is really important. Secondly, Deepak, I think it's really important to get the branding and marketing part of it right. A lot of times people want to brand things by the country name. If you notice my orange example, they didn't call it California oranges, it's sun-kissed. What resonates with the consumer? So a second really important part of it is to have marketing and branding people. How is that brand going to resonate with the consumer? Let's take the example of Divine Chocolate. I think your listeners can look that up. Divine Chocolate dot, I'm sure it's divinechocolate.com. If you look at Divine Chocolate, that is a product out of Ghana. Ghanaian cocoa is excellent. It has that distinctiveness. Some would say it's the best cocoa on the planet. I don't want to offend anybody. There's some good cocoa everywhere. I can't say I've tasted it all, but I know Ghanaian cocoa is really fine. Their farmers were exporting it on the commodity markets. One of the most important things that they did was to brand it correctly. It's not called Ghanaian chocolate, it's called Divine, resonating with the consumer. Um, Fourth was to make sure they had that stakeholder group. I can't remember how many hundreds of thousands now of cocoa farmers in the cooperative. They also wanted to be sure that legally they protected it from one of the larger companies buying it off. So the farmers have a 49% share, which is interesting to be sure that it couldn't be sold off. Operations on the ground are important, and then that positioning piece. You can find Divine Chocolate all over the US and UK being sold at higher end. In Ethiopian coffee, one of the strategies that Ron did, I'll kick back to Ethiopia for a moment to try to answer your question. There are roughly 4 million coffee farmers in Ethiopia. That means about 12 million people, just an average family of three, are benefiting or relying on coffee. So one of the first things Ron did was work with the coffee cooperative in country to make sure that ownership could be established. He also began working with smaller coffee companies who would buy into this strategy. They registered the trademark for Ethiopia, but it was the licensing of that trademark to the smaller companies and then eventually to Starbucks that brought back the 100 million to the farmers. They did a bit of a public media campaign Just back from Ireland, I'm very proud to say Mary Robinson, who was the first female president of Ireland and then head of the UN Commission on Human Rights, went with Ron and a legal team to meet with Howard Schultz at Starbucks. And Howard Schultz allegedly said, I've already filed the trademark. Sorry, Charlie.
I
And
just
Mary Robin, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah.
And Mary Robin,
I just had a pleasure of hosting Mrs. Robinson in India, in Ahmedabad. Yeah,
oh,
I was sharing the stage with her recently.
oh my goodness. Yeah, she's one of my heroes. I love how she said they weren't ready for a female president in the system, so we changed the system. But what she said to Howard Schultz, she said, Howard, this is not a legal issue, it's a human rights issue. And so the licensing ended up being the money return. Sadama, Yirgacheffe, Harar are regions of Ethiopia. But Howard Schultz was not legally wrong. He legally had filed that trademark. But seeing the humane side of it. So, some of it is drawing on the right companies, finding the right person with the Messiah. It's a matter of saying to the jewelry company, wouldn't you want this um, good publicity for you? Wouldn't you want to be known as a B corporation, those who do well and do good, and trying to do that research. So those are some of the strategies. But I think Divine Chocolate has a great model, and their story is clearly outlined. Anyone can look at that as a great reference.
Professor, several chapters in your book highlight the power of the brands, trademarks, and other IP tools. For listeners in development or NGO roles, what are some of the common misconceptions about IP in low income context? And how does your model turn IP into a wealth generation tool rather than a barrier?
Well, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about IP overall. Deepak, as soon as I start talking intellectual property, half my class goes to sleep, right? Hopefully the listeners will not, but people think of it as a legal strategy. Well, it's a business strategy. I think one of the misconceptions is people think IP is just branding. I'm not sure if it's widely known that the brand value of many companies is higher or is at least equal to the physical product. For example, let's see, I have some data here on my slides, but um, and the second part of your question was how it's not a barrier. Yep. Well, it may seem like a mystery, but anyone can file a trademark. Here in the US, it costs about $350 now at the US Patent and Trademark Office. You can search online. I know lawyers would prefer probably we didn't give out this information because I'm not a lawyer, so I still say really good to have a legal team with you. But I've helped people in developing countries to go on to their own country IP offices and register their trademarks. Um, how to not see it as a barrier? Well, I think one of the things the West has done, perhaps with our education, is that so often we go in with education and it can leave a farmer, a low-income farmer, feeling like, oh, one more thing that I'm behind on. One more thing to know, like AI. Oh no, one more thing we're behind on. But being able to show it in actuality is really interesting. The 8 universities in Uganda, for example, that I work with in training, when they go and they go forward and take those steps, we can do this. We can be empowered to own this and begin to take the steps. I think that is the piece that changes that mental model from this is just something out there to this is something we really can do. But all the chapters in my book are about power because it is about power. It's that power of I wrote a book way back called when just about power when I was teaching MBA students. But power is about dependency. Who and what you're dependent upon has the power. And for years, if you look at the African continent, every country but one was colonized. And that one country is Ethiopia. But, it's not that long ago, 1957, Ghana, and 60s, Kenya, and some of the East African countries, a mindset of dependency upon foreign importers is developed quite strongly. I feel that we're in a stage of economic slavery right now when they're only getting 3%, but you become dependent upon that commodity market. You just sell that shea butter. The shea tree in northern Uganda grows for 250 years. We've had it tested. It's the highest quality shea in the world. But the women don't know that. They'll sell it on commodity markets. Sometimes it's can be 600 miles to the nearest port. So that dependency is what really needs to change to realize that there is another way.
Professor, many people often simplify Africa's challenges by citing conflict and governance issues. Yet,
Yeah.
this overlooks the continent's historical context of economic exploitation and the fact that many African nations today are demonstrating strong growth and innovation. How do you see this balance between diplomacy and economic empowerment shaping perceptions of Africa's development?
Thank you, Deepak. I just had a conversation with an ambassador to Africa about this very topic. Um, my view is that when you have countries that are in economic slavery, when unemployment and can be 40, 50%, we can continue to pour money into education, and we should, but let's take a young man coming out of secondary school. If he's facing, 40, 50% unemployment, to me, that lends itself to easily being exploited. Somebody comes along and puts a gun in your hand, gives you identity. It'd be pretty hard to not want to um, join an army. This is not a slight on the young men. It's what are you going to do? And so I think without economic empowerment, we will continue to see the level of conflict that we hear about. Secondly, conflict is, as you said, that's what gets to the newspapers. People don't hear about the amazing young people, the amazing entrepreneurs growing up. Africa has some of the fastest growing economies on the planet, for example. Secondly, this bugs me because I hear this all the time with my work. Well, gosh, Meg, they're always in conflict. And I say, well, look, where was the United States 50, 60 years after we gained our independence? That would have been early 1800s. We still were not granting citizenship to a quarter of our population, those who were enslaved. We still had the Civil War ahead of us. And so, 60, 70 years post-colonialization is not exactly enough time to enable economies to really develop and shore up. Add to that the exploitation. It's very hard to work harder and work faster and develop without some new strategies. So that's why I get excited about this intellectual property, Deepak. I feel like it helps them to leap over some of those barriers, those trade barriers.
Professor, the second edition adds new chapters on funding and ESG goals. How does your IP-based model intersect with the growing pressure on investors and companies to demonstrate real environment, social, and governance impact beyond just ticking ESG boxes?
hmm Well, I am pretty optimistic for a couple of reasons. Social impact investment, the latest figures were 1.5 trillion. People are investing in organizations, in companies, in businesses, in projects that do well and do good. So you're right, there's pressure to be sure you have a solid return on investment. But I think there's another pressure, Deepak, that is growing, and that is the sense that the world order that we've created here with, I'm sorry to say, my own country's domination and making a shambles right now, leaves a lot of people looking for an answer to the question, what can I do to make a difference? I teach young people in my public policy classes. They're graduate students, undergraduates. Half of my undergraduates are already looking at starting nonprofits and doing good. People are realizing that joy is not coming from all the stuff we've accumulated, right? I have more shoes in my closet than I have feet. You know, we are, I think, at least in my country, we're a nation saying, what can we do differently? And I think that's true too with people with money. I really appreciate some of the larger foundations like Rockefeller and Bill Gates deciding not to just have their enormous endowments go on, but I think Bill Gates has made a commitment to spend his down by his in so many years. So I think there's a lot of good out there looking for some good to do. That's my hope. I don't mean to shortchange the fact that there are other factors that, companies want to demonstrate ROI, but I think they also want to demonstrate good.
Professor, you also develop a set of online workbooks that accompany the methods with tools, skills, and step-by-step exercises. How do these workbooks change the learning experience for practitioners? And could you share a story of a group that transformed its business by working through them?
Sure. Thank you. Well, I wrote the book to demonstrate the model, but to also add some credibility to it, in part for our investment community and funding community. The workbooks are practical for on the ground. Five of the workbooks deal with the model that I walk through, why intellectual property in the first place, how does it enable producers to overcome some of the trade barriers, the power of the intellectual property tools, the power of the stakeholder organization and forming it. And so they're very practical. And then the other five are case studies of actual products. Um, they've been translated into some languages on the ground. We translate them into Swahili or Acholi in Uganda, and then put them into digestible pieces. I feel strongly about a train the trainer model. I don't know Acholi. So, and part of our interest is to create systems that sustain when we walk away. I won't be here forever. I'm getting older. And if it doesn't sustain when we walk away, then that's a problem. So the workbooks are designed to be then shared in different ways. Amongst the Maasai, the training was important. We needed to reach a critical mass of Maasai to show that the Maasai had received this information enough to say that the Maasai Intellectual Property Initiative was representing them accurately. So some of the training took place out in the fields, out in the 12 areas. We had frequent meetings at the border of Kenya and Tanzania, but we also did a lot of training by radio. So the training gets put down into its most essential pieces. And then the Maasai signed a certificate that they were part of this training and knowledge. Because one of the arguments that IP lawyers will make about this ownership of the Maasai IP, they'll say, hey, it's already in the public domain. And that's been a challenge for Indigenous people in my country, the Cherokee and the Navajo. If so many companies are using it, it's in the public domain. Our lawyers from Australia were really helpful in doing something like this for the Aboriginal people. And one of my consultants did the largest IP deal ever. It was Star Wars, and have shown how all training and education can be a beginning building block. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
But Deepak, I must say, I did these training modules about a decade ago, and it's changed a bit. The last training I did to about 100 farmers and professors in Uganda, they're they're on the internet. They're able to learn these things really quickly. And so I'm afraid my paper copy workbooks are already a bit dated.
Okay. Professor, many development projects struggle with scale and sustainability once donor funding ends. Based on the power of scale and positioning that you discuss in the book, what design principles should social entrepreneurs follow if they want their ventures to outlive the grand cycle?
Hmm. Well, that's a big question. I I think that beginning with really solid information, really looking at the growth. You know, one of the reasons I'm hopeful about Ugandan shea butter is because I know that that market of skincare is not going to shrink anytime soon. Women like me all want to look like we're 35. Well, I don't because who wants to look like you're 35? I've earned these wrinkles. But we know that that's growing. We know that the population's aging. We know that men's skincare is growing. We know that various markets for baby skincare. So I think that's where your research is really important before you begin. We often will take a year at least really researching, getting our knowledge correct, because this will not work for every product. If that product is not sufficiently distinctive, if the market into which it's going to be positioned is not growing, uh, if if it's breaking into it is too difficult. For example, bananas. We looked at bananas in the Caribbean. Dole and Chiquita have that pretty well sewn up. Those supply chains. That was one that we had to say we're not going to go forward with. So I think your initial knowledge is really important. Like so many brands and so many products, they adapt, they evolve. Sunkissed, I'll go back to my Sunkissed oranges because these guys were really poor. Sunkissed brand is now on about 300 products that have nothing to do with oranges, hats, sweatshirts, you name it. So, establishing that brand, but then being willing to adapt into new markets. I've learned that my shea butter is really good on tattoos, and the tattoo growth is enormous here. So that's I think one of the ways you enable sustainability as any company adapts. Um, yeah, that's a big question, but those are a couple of the things that I would say are important.
Professor Margaret, before we wrap up, one final question. For young social entrepreneurs or students listening to this episode, from least developed countries, what is one concrete step they can take using the ideas in your six-step IP positioning method to start reclaiming more value from the products or services they already produce today?
I love that question, Deepak. I would say the first thing you can do is to study, look at the ashoka.org website. You can type in any country and see what social entrepreneurs are doing in your home country. Um, I have no doubt that there is and are distinctive products in every country. What are they? Um, Sometimes people have something on their heart, honey. Oftentimes I'm in a country and a honey, I'm sorry, what do we call honey farmers will come up to me and say, we have the best honey. Um, I would say finding other change makers. Social entrepreneurship is not a solo effort. I think it gets confused as being a solo effort, a bunch of people running around trying to change the world. But social entrepreneurship has become more of a collective effort. What are the resources that are there? I love social entrepreneurs who use existing resources. I have a colleague, Jeru Billamoria, who went into Bombay. There were thousands of children without homes. She couldn't build homes for everyone, but she used the resource that was there, the children themselves, to be able to set up hotlines and connected with emergency services. Look at your network. Unlock your network. Look at who and whom around you has resources that may not be financial. Drew Billamoria's system now called Childline is in about 90 cities. Got the attention of the Prime Minister eventually. Or Veronica Koza going into South Africa, working with AIDS. Didn't have any money, but there were enormous numbers of grandmothers available to assist. One of my colleagues in Uganda found there was too much goat manure in one part of Uganda, not enough fertilizer in another. How do you put people together? Look at your people network. That would be one of the things I'd say. And be hopeful that change comes from you. It doesn't come from oldsters like me. It usually comes from young people. In fact, my chief event colleague said to me recently, Meg, you've got to hand this off to a young person. I'm not ready to do that. But I get the idea. I'm saying that because you should be hopeful that it's you who will change the world.
Thank you, Professor Brindle, for sharing your time, your research, experience, and powerful insights with us today. Your work at the intersection of social entrepreneurship, intellectual property, and development gives us a concrete roadmap for creating fairer, more inclusive markets. We are grateful for the practical stories and tools you have shared, and I am sure our listeners will walk away inspired to rethink how value is created and who gets to own it. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Deepak. I'd be happy to talk to anybody, including any of those young social entrepreneurs you mentioned. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Bye bye.